Thank you. Thanks Liz, thanks Prosper Canada, thanks IROC for hosting this meeting and inviting me. It's been a great conversation so far, really happy to be here. I do want to note as well that Ray was Skyping from where I work in DC, so I want to get credit for actually being here in person. I came. Thank you. Yeah, hopefully I can get out of Toronto at some point. So the Aspen Financial Security Program, or Aspen FSP, is a nonprofit think tank based in DC that does work on expanding wealth building opportunities for low and moderate income Americans. As some of you may know, we recently launched a new initiative called the Expanding Prosperity Impact Collaborative, or EPIC. So we really like our acronyms at Aspen. We are big on the acronyms. Here's a little bit about EPIC, just as background before I get into the solutions framework. So the idea of EPIC is to, I think, like I said, we're interested in wealth building opportunities at Aspen FSP, but we've come to realize through all the great research that's been happening in this space that that short-term challenges are affecting that ability to build wealth over the long term. And so EPIC is really about shedding light on the economic forces that affect household financial stability in the short term. And the first topic that we chose was income volatility. So we focus on one issue at a time for about 18 to 24 months. And the idea behind picking income volatility was, in one sense, very opportunistic. We saw all the great research that was being produced, which we've heard about already today, and we wanted to create an audience, build an audience for that research. And we also wanted to build the kind of intellectual structures that can build an agenda around that research, both policy and product. So here's a little bit more about the EPIC process, which is three-phased. There's a discovery and a solutions and accelerator phase. Truth be told, we've actually moved all the way through with income volatility and now started a new topic, which is consumer debt, which I'd be happy to talk about at the Q&A, but maybe I'll come back in a few years when we have more to share on that. Right, we're just in the discovery phase of that, but we have moved all the way through with income volatility. And I guess the key takeaway from this slide is that there's just lots of different inputs. So we, at Aspen, are mostly a research translator, so we synthesize what others have done. We have partnered with universities to produce original research. We've also conducted expert surveys, so we curate a list of mostly American, but some international scholars on these issues, and then poll them in terms of what they think the trend lines show. And then we also do consumer surveys, we do private and public convenings. We've talked to a number of the people in this room just through conversations over those years. We try to build expertise that we can then share with the field. So I was asked to give a little bit more information on where we landed on the solution side. I should say I know there's a lot of data nerds in the audience, and once you start talking about solutions, you start kind of getting a little bit conjecture. It's not, a lot of this is a framework that needs more work to be done to test out new ideas around policy and products. But, and I wanted to start with this slide just because we did a lot of pre-work on identifying the causes. We've heard about these already today, but obviously this informed the solutions that we tried to identify. So the big three were unstable earnings, unstable transfer payments or public benefits, and unstable household configurations. Obviously that last one felt a little bit outside of the financial security program's wheelhouse, so we're not recommending, marriage counseling or encouraging. So that one's a little bit off of our specialty. But these are the solution categories that we landed on, which are a little bit more in our wheelhouse. Stable employment as the first, safety net, and liquidity. So stable employment obviously connotes to that first cause that we heard about from Fiona and others, that a big part of the volatility that at least Americans are experiencing are coming from their job. And it's not always a gig economy contingent work job. It could be a full-time job where the hours fluctuate. So really that is about regular hours, predictable earnings, and generous benefits through work. Then the second is the safety net, which we had a question about that in the morning session, and so I'm happy to dive a bit more into that. And then liquidity, really about getting consumers cash at the right moment, the right amount of cash at the right moment, either through savings, credit, or insurance. So as you might have already kind of figured out, the idea here is there's a spectrum. So we are trying to think about possible responses to income volatility, and we're starting on the left where there's really a preventative measures, where like how can we stop volatility from even occurring in the first place. And I know Rob talked about some volatility might be good and there's some spikes that you want to take advantage of, but there is a sense that at least for the pre-tax income that folks are getting, we want that to be as stable as we can. And we're not talking about when they're paid, right? We're talking about when they're actually working. So that's the first category. And then it moves to the right, so liquidity is at the right, where we're talking more about mitigating the ill effects of volatility. So at that point, you've already earned what you're going to earn in the labor market. There's already been maybe some redistribution and social insurance in the safety net category. Now it's really about timing cash to be available when you need it. The other thing we like about this framework is that it gives all the different institutions, you can see there on the left, a role to play. So, especially given the political context in the US right now, we want to be engaging as much as we can with the private sector, so technology companies, financial service providers, employers. We identify in the brief that we wrote on the solutions framework all sorts of ways that they can make a difference in these three areas. I'm not going to go through all of them because it's a long list, but the brief is called Managing the Swings, and I'll put the website up at the end, but I'm happy to forward that around afterwards. So there were, let me go back 1 second. So we did identify 6 interventions that we thought were especially promising. There was a lot of energy around them. We don't endorse specific policy proposals, but we do like to so we wrote in-depth policy briefs about the potential of these 6 possible interventions. They're listed at the bottom. So predictable scheduling, unemployment insurance and wage insurance, shortfall savings, payroll innovations, and hybrid financial products. So I'm going to quickly go through these. I know that we have a panel coming up next that's going to talk more in depth about their other discrete ideas. And like I said, we have an issue brief on each one of these, so I don't have quite enough time to go through in detail, but happy to discuss in the Q&A. So for stable employment, I already mentioned that the idea here is trying to address the earnings that folks are getting in the labor market. Not so much when they're being paid, we'll get to payroll innovation in that third category, but just the quality of the job. And as we've already heard, scheduling is a huge part of this. As Ray said in his presentation, 40% of those in America who report having income volatility blame scheduling. It's by far the most popular answer. And there's a number of different ways that policymakers or fintech entrepreneurs or others at financial service providers could try to help address this. The 2 that I'll mention are just government setting labor standards. So in the US, there's a number of jurisdictions that have set minimum hours that you have to give certain workers, or advance notice that you have to provide to workers in order for them. If you change the schedule on them at the last minute, let's say, you have to pay an extra overtime kind of time and a half wage. It's still pretty early days knowing exactly how those programs are being received and how effective they are, but we're hopeful about that. And then the second one, which is more private sector, obviously, is just employers coming to the realization that they don't want their employees living in such a volatile way. So Walmart, for example, in the US has announced scheduling reforms, and there's a Montreal-based company actually called WorkJam that is doing workforce management systems that at least claim to take into account worker preferences and are able to use algorithms to make sure that no shifts are left behind, but that workers have advance notice and have steady hours. So that's an interesting area for further study. Moving on to the two interventions that we listed in the that we chose to focus on in the safety net department. The first is unemployment insurance. So I'll be particularly brief on this one because I'm not an expert on unemployment insurance here in Canada, and I don't know how similar UI in the US is to Canada's system. But the UI system in the States has a lot of flaws. It only covers a fraction of workers, and it does, yeah, so maybe that's the same. And it doesn't really account for drops in hours. If you lose your entire job, then you can get UI, but if you're going week to week and you're losing some hours, it's not the right program for that. But we think it can be. So we have some proposals in our paper that talk about potential ways to make UI more modernized and better equipped to deal with volatile incomes. And then wage insurance is a bit of a newer idea that we explored within the safety net category. Again, social insurance, so pretty government-centric. But the idea here is that if you do lose your job or you take a new job where your wages are lower than they were before, we help you, the government helps you make up the difference. Canada actually experimented on this in the 1990s, the Earning Supplement Project, some of you might be aware. And President Obama in his last year or two actually made a pretty big proposal in his budget to make wage insurance a universal benefit. There's been some evaluations of it. There is some evidence that it would lessen the length of unemployment spells and would get people working again at slightly lower wages. So that is another potential avenue for the safety net to step in. Now I know we didn't focus on things like the tax refunds that we've talked about, but that would fall under the safety net category. There's lots of proposals in the US about how you maybe change the way you pay out the tax refund so that instead of exacerbating folks' volatility, it's actually coming in periodically throughout the year. There's also really interesting work going on in the US about how you rewrite the rules around means-tested benefits so that if you have one really good month, you don't just lose access to your housing, let's say, since that obviously would be pretty counterproductive. And you can imagine all of what we heard this morning about the volatile incomes. Just our safety net programs, at least in the States, are not well equipped to deal with that. So now onto liquidity. We had 3 different interventions that we identified under this category that we thought held promise. The first is one that we've heard a lot about already, which is we call it shortfall savings or short-term savings. And those numbers are actually from Fiona's earlier slide about kind of what you need in those income quintiles to deal with just a median amount of the volatility that they're seeing in their data. So these are pretty significant numbers, and as Fiona stressed, I mean, one of the key things to know here is this is not the once in a year car repair, or once every 2 years, roof replacement. So they're not really true emergencies. This is just the day-to-day, the new reality of many workers in, at least in the US, are seeing volatility. They need to access savings to be able to smooth that out. Now, I think probably others will talk on the panel about all the different ways to potentially do this. So there's lots of fintech, apps that are thinking about how in the background of your checking account can a smart algorithm, take money from your checking account when they know that you have enough money to last for the month and save it. There's obviously really smart behavioral interventions that potentially could help with the micro saving. Finally, well, not finally, second on the liquidity category is payroll innovations. This kind of goes to Fiona's point about the 5 Friday months, right? Our paychecks are not really lining up in any rational way with our expenses. Most of our expenses are month to month, and yet we're paid, a lot of us are paid every 2 weeks. And not only that, there's also this opportunity, I think, within the payroll moment, I guess I could say, where you have this power to deduct money before people actually see it come into their accounts. You have the power to determine when the money is going to get into the account, and like I said, try to line up with expenses. And it's also universal. So even if you're a gig worker, even if you're a contingent worker, you have to be paid somehow. So there's some platform somewhere, either a pay card or a payroll provider that's going to be there. So if you want to deliver universal benefits, portable benefits, that seems like a great nexus from which to do it. So finally, hybrid financial products was the last of the solutions that we highlighted as part of the framework. Basically, the idea here is to combine what had traditionally been separate products, like a savings product, a credit product, an insurance product, and mash them together, if only because the consumer doesn't care, right? The consumer wants cash when they need the cash, and they don't really care if it's coming from their savings or it's coming from credit or it's coming from insurance. And so the idea here is to have a product that can know which is the right tool for them in that moment, which is a big task, and I don't think anybody is quite close to cracking the egg quite yet. And I know CFSI and others have done a lot of work on secured credit cards and prepaid cards with a savings pocket. There's lots of hybrid approaches out there. The one that we at the Financial Security Program have spent the most time thinking about is what we call a sidecar rainy day savings account, which basically attaches to, we're basically a liquid rainy day account that attaches to a traditional retirement account. In the States, our traditional retirement accounts are a lot more liquid than they are here, and so in a pinch, a lot of Americans pay really high fees to get money out of their retirement, which obviously leads to less security in their old age, and also is just not a smart way to be allocating resources in the present. So that's one example of a potential hybrid product. So finally, before I close, I did want to mention, I mentioned the expert surveys. One interesting finding from those that I think is kind of a good framing politically for how we think about all of these interventions is that the institutions that the experts identified as the best positioned to help either, in this case, reduce volatility, and then in this one it was to help families manage volatility. So the big institutions that they think are best positioned, right? Big employers, federal government, financial, mainline financial institutions are not the ones that the experts have picked that they thought are the most likely to actually act, right? There does seem to be a little bit of a lack of will among those big players to get into this field, and I'd love to be corrected by the panel, so we'll see. I might not be up on all the great innovation that's happening, but most of the innovation is happening at the state and local level. It's happening in fintech, pretty small fintech companies, and I just think it's something to have on our radar that eventually we'll need some of the big institutions to buy in if we're going to see much progress in this area. So with that, there's my contact information. Please follow us on Twitter. And thanks so much for your time. Happy to answer questions either now or at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, David. That was wonderful. We do have time for questions. You're remarkably on track. So we've got about 6-7 minutes here if people would like to ask any questions. Patrick, you in the back.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Yeah, awesome presentation. I know you mentioned that I guess the ideas weren't kind of battle tested in market yet, but it looked like in your process there was some way of kind of vetting or evaluating those ideas or prototype solutions. Love to just hear a little bit more about how kind of far these ideas are down that path, and therefore like maybe how likely to be successful if someone were to pick one of them up.
Yeah, no, good question. So we try as much as we can to partner with financial companies and employers to actually pilot. That's not exactly our bread and butter. I think maybe Rob at CFSI can speak a little bit more about some of the great pilots that they're running. The sidecar savings, I know there are actually a few panels, a few pilots running in the States now, and there's also one that's going to be running in the UK with the NEST program there, the retirement program in the UK. So that one's a little bit further along. In the US, there's some legal regulatory constraints to doing that, right? So we can automatically enroll you in a retirement account in the US, but not just a savings account, not just an emergency savings account. And so getting uptake for something like that could be a challenge. But yeah, happy to connect as well on some of the other ideas if you're interested.
Catherine.
I really appreciated that. It's great to sort of move from the big research picture down to what are people thinking about how to move it. And obviously the big structural pieces, EI reform and the like, obviously that's a fairly complex task, but these, are you leaning to more behavioral economic sort of ideas, and like what's your sense, I think people focus, like is there potentially a big benefit to that? Like would these, I guess people would be inclined to actually pursue these sorts of things? As your research suggests that people would, if they set it up, they were setting up a bank account and they had these sorts of automatic features, they had enough faith in the institution that would work probably to support their financial, like is your sense that there's sort of an appetite for this and that there's potentially large benefit to moving in these sort of would be rather more smaller interventions that may potentially, given the complexity of the larger public policy challenges on the table?
Yeah, it's a really good, we struggle with this because I think at the end of the day, wages have stagnated in the US. There's these big problems that are obviously contributing. It's not just volatility, as we've heard. There's lots of things that are hampering Americans' balance sheets. And so, a new app that helps you budget or that moves money around in a clever way is probably not going to solve it all. And we recognize that. I think we're also realistic about what the political environment, at least in the US, can produce in terms of policy right now. And so we're looking elsewhere, frankly, under Chatham House rules. Yeah. So I don't have a great answer on that question. I do think, as I actually mentioned in the last answer, that especially these families that we know are overwhelmed and stressed by their finances are not, in the app store searching for budgeting apps, right? Like they're not. So at the end of the day, I think there does need to be some automatic enrollment element to these products, or some way to reach scale very quickly and capture a big segment of the market. And then I do think that they have value. But right now, I am a little bit of a skeptic that they'll scale without some sort of nudge from either government or employer.
Or a bank.
Has there been any evidence in certain states, here in Canada, one of the things that just came with the last budget is the automatic enrollment of, I'm going to get this, they've changed the name, no, it's not WIPI anymore. The workers, basically our earning income supplement program will be an automatic enrollment, which was a huge win. Does that, those sorts of features feature in any of the American states? Are they doing that kind of thing now?
Yeah. There are. So on the retirement side, obviously, automatic enrollment has been a big advance, and there are states in the U.S. that are now launching programs that automatically enroll workers who don't have access to a workplace pension or workplace retirement account into what's effectively an individual account that's run by the state. So that's one of the more ambitious policy levers that we've seen used. Our earned income tax credit is basically the wage subsidy. Sounds like a similar program. And I know because I actually volunteer and help low-income folks fill out their taxes every year, and it is a huge headache, and it's really, really hard. And so automatic enrollment in that program would be absolutely, huge. That would be very valuable. So I think that's something for us to consider. But as we've heard, there's also problems around, people waiting until their tax refund comes in to get medical care and stuff like that, which is probably not an ideal way to run a wage supplement either. So, yeah.
Great. Was there somebody else over there who had a question, had their hand up before? Oh, now you're shy. Okay, Eric.
Thanks, great presentation, David. In the course of this research, did you look at the concept of prize-linked savings accounts or lottery-linked savings accounts at all? And if you did, could you speak to your findings on that?
Yeah, sure. So again, other speakers I think have done a lot of work on gamification and prize-linked savings. And we really, in our short-term savings brief, do briefly try to synthesize what's out there on that. We're probably not the best source for like the literature review on whether it works or not. I mean, the stuff that I've read is that it can be very effective at getting folks to save. And for folks who aren't familiar, basically the idea here is that you, that instead of getting interest, or maybe sometimes in addition to getting interest on your savings account, you get entered into a lottery. So effectively using the gambling high, the adrenaline of being in a lottery to get people to do something that they, otherwise feels like eating your broccoli, which is saving money. So it's a really cool behavioral intervention. I think has a lot of promise. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is somebody who did their PhD on this, which I have a copy of. So if anybody wants it, just shoot me an email.
Great.
Are there any other questions? Great. Well, I'd like to thank you again, David. That was wonderful,
Thank
and you
you.
really set the stage for this afternoon.